Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Julia Joja. I'm with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown, and George Washington University, and I'm joined by.
Giselle Donnelly. I work at the American Enterprise Institute, where I'm a senior fellow and also.
Dalit Burhaj, also a senior fellow at AEI.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace that tend to emerge along a line running from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Today, we are joined by Minna Olander, who is a research fellow at FIA, or the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, and currently a visiting fellow also at the Center for European Policy Analysis here in Washington, D.C. Minna, it's great to have you with us. We've all been through the last year or so, following with pleasure your tweets, and we have a few things that we want to talk to you about. Of course, Finland is a main element, but maybe we can start broad with Nordic security and where we are. Of course, the buzzword now, or the buzz term, is that the Baltic Sea, with Finland having joined and Sweden already on the way of joining, has become officially a NATO lake. And with that in mind, you also talk about and have written about how the war itself and Ukraine's resistance and Ukraine's fighting back have also changed regional security. And so I want to ask you about that to get our conversation going, and to also kind of maybe challenge or question the issue of the Baltic Sea now being 100% NATO lake, because on the other side we still have Russia there with two borders, or two ways of accessing the Baltic Sea, including with the enclave of Kaliningrad, and it's still a challenge. So tell us how you assess the situation now in 2023.
First of all, thanks a lot for having me here. It's a real pleasure. And I would say about your question that it is, of course, important to remember that Finland and Sweden joining NATO is a massive change in the whole Baltic Sea security architecture, but it's not an automatism. So it's not like a silver bullet that itself just solves all our problems. This is basically the moment when the work really starts, and we have this window of opportunity, and that is very much thanks to Ukraine's resistance, as you mentioned, because Russia is currently getting its conventional force depleted to a really remarkable extent in Ukraine. So Ukraine has literally bought us time to get our regional security in order. There were several countries in the past 30 years that dismantled their territorial defense. Sweden, Denmark, Norway to an extent, a little bit less maybe. But now we have this chance to make all that right, figure out what is the Russian threat in this region and how to counter it. So as soon as Sweden joins, we will have to start making the NATO defense plans for the whole region and kind of start rethinking the regional security outside of the box of the Eastern the EFP, the Enhanced Forward Presence. So that's maybe my take where we are now. So basically at the beginning of a very long road.
It is fair to say that Sanna Marin has been, the favorite Nordic social democrat to many of us, in the neocon community, so to speak, and particularly during this war, thanks to her very sort of strong posture towards Russia and her leadership, and so people have been asking this question of what, if anything, changes in Finland in terms of security, defense, Ukraine policy, willingness to help Ukraine join EU and NATO going forward with this new cabinet led by Petteri Orpo and the Kokoomus led coalition. I mean, the early signs seem quite encouraging, but you probably have a much deeper understanding of what is happening behind the scenes and where the different political parties are on some of these subjects. So anything you can share on this would be appreciated.
So Finland has a very strong foreign and security policy consensus culture, and there's always a very strong continuity between different governments. So especially on Ukraine and NATO, it was quite interesting. They weren't even election topics because there's just such consensus across the political spectrum on both the support to Ukraine and on the NATO membership that they just weren't like politically relevant questions. So Sanna Marin was a particularly visible and good at having these mic drop moments because she's in this way like very to the point, and it came naturally to her that when she was asked how this war could end, that she was like, well, of course Russia has to leave Ukraine. So that was of course like a very good PR for Finland, and she was great for Finland's kind of international image and everything. And I doubt that Petteri Orpo, our new prime minister, can quite like live up to that standard. He's a much more boring type of politician, I'm afraid. So I think that you can expect less these kind of headlines and viral videos with him. Although who knows? We have to give him a chance, of course. But on the like bigger lines, nothing will change. Finland is, as I said, like there's this understanding that as a small country with this kind of geopolitical location, we can't afford to be very like we can't afford to have a lot of cracks in our society and politics that can be exploited about especially security, national security. So there are no big changes to be expected there. Actually, in the government program that was released a couple of days ago, there was this sentence on Ukraine's NATO membership that Finland will support Ukraine's aspirations together with other allies. So it sounds like it's not the strongest formulation, but it means basically that Finland definitely supports Ukraine's NATO membership.
Can I just quickly follow up on that and ask you about the language, because that's trickling down from every single country now. What exactly is the language? Is it if the conditions or the circumstances permit, or just support, period?
And so as far as like I haven't read the whole document, so I would have to double check this whether there's anything more precise on it. But it says that Finland supports with the other allies. So and I don't recall that there would have been any kind of caveat about the war ending or something first, but I would have to double check that.
Before we expand the aperture even more, I do have a couple questions about Finnish accession to NATO and how. I mean, there's no question that it is a good thing that strengthens the alliance in many ways, but it does change the equation for the alliance in the Nordic theater, if we can call that, which has heretofore been principally a maritime theater, but obviously with and I'm not suggesting that attacking Finland over land is really an appealing, choice for anyone, especially the Russians. But it does make you wonder, and because Finland has been so sort of autonomous in its security posture up until now, it does make you ask how this whole new arrangement is going to add to or shift alliance strategy making and force allocation and stuff like that. And in particular, in addition to the things that Finland will contribute to the joint defense of Europe, the question that really hasn't been very much asked is, what would Finland like to get out of the alliance beyond the sort of Article 5 security guarantees, but are there practical elements of, and again, much military cooperation has been going on just in the normal course of business before now. But again, what did the Finns, and especially the government and maybe the military leadership, want to see the alliance doing to help in the defense of, in bolstering Finnish security?
Well, Finland joined NATO most of all to maximize the deterrence. So the idea is, or was until last year, that we had our own national defense, and that was the deterrence, so that, like, Russia would know that what a bad idea it is to try and attack Finland, because we have kept up like precisely the kind of capabilities that we now see that Ukraine needs to defend against the Russian invasion. But then there was this realization that you can't trust that to be enough, and that we should do whatever we can to maximize the deterrence and minimize the likelihood of Russia ever again invading us. So that was basically the NATO membership decision, why it happened last year. And so interestingly, before this had been at all like decided on the highest political level, a little town in western Finland with a population of 15,000 went ahead and decided that they want a NATO base. So this town in western Finland called Kauhava, which has 15,000 inhabitants, went ahead and decided that they want a NATO base, and this was after 2 weeks of NATO membership. Before this had been at all really even discussed on the higher political levels. So that was quite the funny demonstration of what maybe regions expect and think about the NATO membership. Now in the new government program, and again I have only skimmed it, but there was a mention that Finland would like to have some NATO elements in Finland, maybe a training center or something like that. So this is indeed a good question, because Finland gets asked at the moment quite frequently, on the one hand, like what can you contribute to the EFP in the Baltic states, but also, do you want to have EFP elements in Finland? And that kind of, I think, illustrates quite well that now with Finland and soon also hopefully Sweden in NATO, NATO needs to start thinking about this arrangement in more broader terms, because Finland and Sweden joining just changes the equation so much that the EFP may not be the only solution, the viable solution here. Obviously, NATO already last year decided that it wasn't sufficient anyways, and is now going back to this like forward defense, or trying to rebuild a forward defense posture. But I think this is quite a good illustration of how Finland is kind of in between there. And what I also find interesting is whether Finland will just consider itself a continuation of the eastern flank, or will Finland go for kind of northern flank identity, for example, because for Finland it's so important to always emphasize that we're a Nordic country, not, for example, a Baltic country, and so on, and definitely not an Eastern European country. So this is again this messed up European understanding of geography. But so these are all quite interesting questions, and I would just like to add, because you mentioned that the theater has been mostly maritime so far, but now Finland brings this long land border. I would like to add that there's another maritime theater further up in the Arctic that also comes into the picture now. So, and that is a whole new set of headache for NATO. So that is also something quite important to keep in mind.
Just for translate for regular viewers, EFP stands for Enhanced Forward Presence, which refer to the small units that from Western European countries mostly, and the United States, that have been rotating through the Baltic states over the last 5 or 6 years. And as Minna said, the alliance is now moving toward regularly, permanently stationed forward forces, such as those that were in West Germany, although at a much smaller level, like Germany during the Cold War. Sorry, just to translate from military speak to English.
If I may just sort of jump in while we are on the subject of NATO, there is this sort of conversation in America about the increased importance of the Indo-Pacific and Asia, which also raises this question of what NATO's role should be outside of a sort of traditional theater of operation and securing the security of of the eastern flank and of Europe more broadly. And there are different voices within the alliance, those who would like NATO to just focus on its traditional role, and those who all feel comfortable with greater outreach to countries like Japan and Korea and a possible European role in the security in the Indo-Pacific. Does Finland's accession and prospectively Sweden's accession make it more likely that or less likely that NATO will play a role outside of its traditional area of operation, so to speak?
Well, I think that in Finland there is quite a good understanding that, of course, we have to widen our horizon a lot. It's entirely fair to point out that Finland has been so focused on the own national defense for basically 8 decades, that it is quite a challenge, and that is actually one of the biggest challenges of Finland joining NATO. The kind of changing mentality, starting to think in these 360 degrees terms, and about your own national defense as part of collective defense, and what your contribution is to very far away allies, security and all that. So what is interesting about the Indo-Pacific and China, and how that potentially links to the Nordic-Baltic region, is again the Arctic. China is increasingly interested in the Arctic region, and trying to establish more presence there. This is of course also a factor in the Chinese-Russian relationship and how it shapes going forward. So in a way, in the Arctic sphere, China also needs to be countered there, and that is kind of how it links from kind of European Arctic all the way to the Indo-Pacific. For example, the Northern Sea route is becoming increasingly all year round navigable, which is very important for Russia, especially now that it needs the Asian markets, China and India, even more for its energy exports because of the Western sanctions on Russian energy products. This is quite an important angle, I think, that is not yet sufficiently understood in the US either. How kind of there is this quite direct link even between the European and the Indo-Pacific theater, and how this Northern Sea Route, for example, links these regions and theaters potentially much more closely. And then kind of like how like Russia is of course the one in between there. So I think that Finland is also quite aware of the limits of our capacity. So we don't have the kind of navy that we could send a ship to the Indo-Pacific. That would make absolutely no sense either. So I think that there is more this idea definitely that we should try to take as much responsibility in our own region as possible, so that we then free allied capabilities from here to then like maybe be put into the Indo-Pacific, or like to pay more attention there. So I think this is very much a question of like fair burden sharing within the alliance as well.
I'm really glad you brought that up, and that you're actually spelling out these connections that I don't think, indeed, you're right. We're not thinking about them sufficiently in the United States, and I would argue nor do we in Europe. So then let me ask you kind of one question with two sides to it. On the one side, or the first part of the question would be, how do you then look at the Arctic from a Finnish perspective in the context of NATO? Basically, to what extent do you think that Finland is going to further push the Arctic into NATO discussions? We know that it has been taking shape over the last few years. There's very much an ongoing conversation about that, including in Washington. But it seems to me, especially through what you're saying, being responsible or providing security for your own region, that this could be a possible role of Finland, making the Arctic more NATO, or more of a NATO region. And I think this is important also when we're thinking, yes, of course, about China primarily from the perspective of the United States, but also from a Russian perspective, because Russia is defining its flank, or arc of steel, as they call it, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, not from the Baltic to the Black Sea, much broader than we do. So this is the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question is, I guess, connected to a bit of a scoop. The Biden administration is likely going to, looking at the eastern flank next year, going to ask more questions and foster more of an understanding that particularly the two anchors, Poland and Romania, have to become more of a security provider for the region. And so then the second part of the question to you is Finland, do you see Finland becoming a third anchor on this flank? And how can, in the context of what you were just saying, with enhanced forward presence and possible troop contributions anywhere, or military contributions overall, how can Finland then become more of a security provider beyond its own border?
So about the Arctic and whether kind of Finland will bring it into NATO in a way, I think certainly yes, because I mean this is kind of an interesting question in the sense that the Arctic didn't feature a whole lot in Finnish defense thinking for a long time either, and it has been more of a recent development in the last couple of years that even Finland has like kind of moved from the very strong traditional focus on the Baltic Sea and southeastern Finland to view this region more comprehensively, kind of going from like the Baltic Sea through the North Atlantic all the way to the Arctic. So this is also kind of a new trend in Finland. It has like several reasons. First of all, like for Finland, of course, like the vicinity to Russian population centers is much more in the southeast. So St. Petersburg is not far away from Helsinki, only about 400 kilometers. And that's kind of like where most of the border traffic happens and all that. Plus that we have some very nice natural defense elements in Lapland, in the northern part of Finland. For example, as a legacy of the Ice Age, when the ice melted, it kind of was grinding the mountains that used to be spiky at the time, they are not anymore, into like smaller rocks and boulders, and we have this kind of like pretty vast fields of just rocks and boulders in the forests, which are pretty difficult to cross, for example, with yeah, exactly. Infantry tanks, something like that, like just forget it. So that's kind of like a practical situation for Finland, and in southeast we have an incredible number of lakes all over the place. So there's almost no like straight road going through it. So that's also like a big challenge for any kind of enemy movement from there. But yes, Finland will definitely, and this is particularly interesting from the Norwegian point of view now that Finland joined NATO, because Norway has been so far kind of like the sole gatekeeper of the High North, as they call it, in NATO, and Norway and Canada have been very much like keeping the Arctic off NATO's agenda, and this will change now because, for example, Norway used to have this two-track or dual-track approach towards Russia, which was based on the one hand deterrence, and that was provided by the NATO membership, and reassurance, which was kind of like good bilateral relations. The reassurance part included this kind of self-imposed limitations that the Norwegians don't like it being called that. They always rather point out that it's calibrated deterrence, which is a good way of putting it. It means that you can also recalibrate it when needed, which they are right now doing. But that they were refraining from, especially NATO exercises above a certain degree, like in the north, in the northernmost part of Norway called Finnmark, they wouldn't like hold exercises and so on. And now it's of course interesting, like if Finland just starts holding massive NATO exercises in Lapland, it kind of draws the carpet from under under Norway's approach in a way, and then like there's not so much point anymore to this kind of self-imposed limitations on Norway's part. On the one hand, it can be also very good for Norway because then they don't anymore have the sole responsibility. They are not the only ones responsible for managing the NATO Russia relationship in the Arctic. So it can be good or bad depending on whom you ask in Norway. But that's very interesting in that sense, and I think there's definitely a strong expectation in Finland and in Sweden as well that the Arctic will of course be part of the regional defense plans once also Sweden is full member, because we have a lot of defense cooperation with Sweden and Norway in the northern parts of our countries. For example, the air forces have been exercising on an almost weekly basis already since 2009, and all of these existing things of course must be incorporated into NATO's defense plans then, and because this region is such a big part of our countries, it can't be just like be left out, like that would be half of our country. So there is definitely an expectation there for NATO to kind of develop some kind of Arctic posture as well, and it will be a tricky question because Russia has its very core nuclear arsenal there in the form of the nuclear submarines, which constitute the Russia's second strike capability. So it will be kind of Well, it will need some careful calibrating. Let's say how to calibrate, especially for example, U.S. presence there. But this needs to be addressed so that we don't have the problem in the future that there's some ambiguity left in the region that Russia then can use for its own purposes. About like what Finland, how Finland could become like another anchor, I think that would be a very suitable role for Finland to be kind of in a way also a vector, as I mentioned, between the Eastern Front and the Northern Front, because in a way you do have actually a Northern Front up there in the Arctic with Norway. So I think that would be a very, very good idea. Finland has, of course, right now capabilities geared very much toward defending our own eastern border. So it's possible that we need to develop some more kind of mobile elements that can be then deployed somewhere else. But this will very much depend on the NATO targets and planning process when we get there. An interesting factor is also the Nordic cooperation, which will now come into NATO. So it already exists since 2009 in the format called NORDEFCO, Nordic Defense Cooperation, and there's a whole new momentum on that since Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO, and overall the invasion, because like all the Nordic countries felt the urgency very much, and everyone defines Russia as a major or the security threat in the region. So one very interesting example was this memorandum of understanding that was signed between Finland, Sweden, Norway and Denmark. Iceland doesn't have its own armed forces, so it's a little bit a different case, but between the Nordic air forces, that they will start developing the cooperation into kind of operating the approximately 250 fighter jets that the Nordic countries have in total as like one operational fleet. It won't mean that there will be one single integrated air force, but basically that you can have combinations of these four countries' air forces very flexibly deployed. So that is, for example, a very interesting step. I would expect something similar to happen in between the navies as well. It would be a very natural next step to take. Finland and Sweden, for example, already have joint navy units and all that. So this is also kind of like a new element that comes into NATO, in the sense that there is this high degree of cooperation and even integration already between the countries. Which is, I think, kind of unique within NATO.
Yeah, almost running into a sort of hard time constraint, but before we let you go, we need to ask you about Germany, where you've lived and you've written on German security policy, both the new security strategy. You have shared your thoughts on Twitter on Germany's attitude towards future NATO enlargements, including Ukraine's accession. Please give us a flavor of what your thoughts are on the Scholz government's policies in this space.
Well, I would say that my glass is increasingly half full. Last year it was more half empty. And there have been some very interesting developments this year in Germany, especially the change in the Ministry of Defense. The new minister Boris Pistorius has had an interesting effect on Germany's Zeitenwende process. This like kind of effort to take security seriously again. So I think there is very much hope for Germany. It's just the problem remains that Germany is too slow to implement the changes. So, for example, the national security strategy, it reads more like maybe a kind of government report than an actual strategy document. It's a very good description of the security environment and the challenges that Germany is facing. But it kind of, on many, in many places, it kind of lacks the how. It describes the what, but and then also there's a long list of ambitions and aims, but it kind of doesn't really explain how to get there. So it is a start, but it will require a much more detailed kind of plan. And what I think was a little bit regrettable is that the 2% goal of defense spending is only included, or it is only foreseen to be fulfilled as long as this 100 billion special fund for the armed forces in Germany lasts. But the strategy didn't foresee like more long-term sustainable raise of the regular defense budget. So that kind of raises the question of sustainability of these changes that Germany is trying to implement, and kind of like how seriously Germany really means it in the long term. And on Ukraine's NATO membership, I think that it's kind of a tricky question for Germany's government, because they have been very cautious about any kind of escalation, and also because this is something that Chancellor Scholz repeats frequently, that we can't do anything that could lead to a NATO-Russia war. And of course, the idea is then that if Ukraine joins NATO before this war is over, that could lead precisely to this NATO-Russia war. So I think that is, in Germany, what keeps the government awake regarding this question.
There's a sort of, existential waiting for Olaf, waiting for Germany dimension to this melodrama. So at this point, like, the Zeitenwende speech is almost 18 months in the rearview mirror. And I haven't, as a sometime participant in the writing of national security documents, hesitate to read any more ever again in my life. At some point, you have to say, we need to judge these people by what they do, by their behavior rather than their aspirations or their statements of intent. And, whether they spend $100 billion before or after the end of the Russo-Ukrainian war is an interesting, drinking game that maybe we should have at some point. So, Minna, look, you've paid as close attention to this as anybody that I can think of. If you had to say right now how this will play itself out, are the Germans waiting for the situation to sort of return to normal, in which they can go back to being, Angela Merkel's Germany, or is there a real sea change afoot that we really should be patient and but confident that it'll all turn out for the best?
There's this perfect German word to answer this question, and it's Jein. Exactly. So Jein means yes or no. So I believe that it has to at no point be the problem that Germany would act in bad faith, or that they would be, of course, like, they are not enthusiastic about having to do all the military stuff. Like, that just doesn't come naturally to modern day Germany, and that's like very uncomfortable for them. I believe that there is a genuine willingness to get their own house in order, like get their armed forces back to into some kind of shape again, and because it has become quite embarrassing actually, like the state of the German armed forces. So there is this willingness to get that in order. I think that there's also a genuine willingness to play a bigger role in European security, but the problem is kind of like lack of competence, in the sense that because security and defense were like such irrelevant policy fields for so long, that wide parts of the political leadership and even in the parliament there's just not much like understanding of basic how deterrence works, how like why you need defense in the first place, and all of this is kind of even harder to communicate to the public, which has been very much. There's actually also a good Swedish word. They call themselves kind of peace damaged, that because there was such a long time of period of peace that they have kind of forgotten how it is if there is no peace. So I think that the Germans are definitely also in that sense like kind of peace damaged, although the period of peace has been much shorter in Germany than in Sweden. But you are absolutely right that you always have to look what is being done and not only what is being said. And my worry is about Germany that despite good intentions, it just takes too long, and the momentum will kind of blow over at some point. The urgency is already less than a year ago in the political leadership, and the population is at this moment still very supportive of Ukraine and also of the higher defense spending, but that will not last forever. And at some point it will be hard to explain to the German population why investments should be made in war fighting gadgets instead of, I don't know, yeah, and like childcare infrastructure and other things that have just like not been invested in during the Merkel era. So I think that there is a genuine willingness and an attempt, but the how is again the problem, that like Germany is struggling with like with figuring out how to do this, and especially how to do it fast enough.
I'm going to take advantage of having the last word to say here, kind of rhetorically. What would European security be without having to wait for the Germans? I was reading yesterday, I think, this piece about forward defense in NATO, which made me understand that forward defense is something that we actually invented at the end of the 40s as we were creating NATO. And even back then, around 1950, the issue was how do we convince then Western Germany to contribute troops? So it seems like, European security in this instance too has something cyclical about it, and would lose some of its charm if we wouldn't have this problem. Mina Olander, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
From me, Julia Joja, and my friends,
Giselle Donnelly and
Dalibor Rohach.
thank you for listening to the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. To stay up to date with the Eastern Front, please give us a follow on Twitter at Eastern Front Pod, one word, and sign up for our newsletter through the link included in the show notes. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye.